Hey everybody, welcome to your weekly debrief where we take a deep breath and take a look at some of the headlines. This is SmartHER News. I'm Jenna. I'm super excited to talk to you today about all of these big stories that really have been developing over the last, several weeks, but really we've seen some significant developments over the last few days. And this is such a great opportunity for us just to hang out together for a little bit, not too long. I don't want to overstay my welcome, but just take a little time to go through some of the headlines. You may notice on SmartHER News that we've been trying a bunch of different things when it comes to video content, and that's for several different reasons. We've had some issues, challenges around social media, and also I've had some issues in my own life, my own crazy life. I really want to be consistent with the sort of content we're producing for you. And we've just had, as you know, all these crazy things that have happened over the last couple of weeks, from sickness to the unexpected. I had something happen this week where a family member wound up in the hospital, and so this is life. I know as a working mom, I know you're facing a lot of these challenges too. And so we're just trying to figure it out. So thanks for rolling with us, because over the last 4 years, next weekend is our 4-year anniversary. I have tried a bunch of different things, and I've enjoyed all of it. We've learned from all of it, and you've been such a big help through all of it. So thank you for that. I just want to preface this conversation about where we're at today. I got everything set up, and then suddenly I was like, where's my phone? Where's my phone? I'm actually using my phone to record, so that's where the phone is. You guys set things down. You're like, where did that just go? What just happened? The craziest thing that ever happened to me as far as that is it was the evening. I was watching my kids play. It was, late in the day, so I was tired. I had just had a baby, and I was like, where's the baby? Like, the baby wasn't walking or crawling yet. So, like, where's the baby? I was nursing the baby. So this thing, it could happen. It's like you have these moments. You're like, am I all here? Yes, I am all here. And I'm all here for these big stories. So you've sent in some great questions about a lot of these big stories you're seeing in the news. And just getting back to our intention, my intention here is to give you some strong foundations for these stories. So when you hear headlines, you're like, oh, I understand what's going on here. And also to explain why these stories matter. Why do these stories really matter? There's always going to be a lot of different opinions. There's going to be a lot of different angles on these stories, but we just want to make sure that we confront them in a way that makes us feel smarter. There's where the name comes from. So I'm going to start with something today. Again, I've said it once, I've said it twice, I will stand by it always, that when you say the word inflation, that's not the way to increase your audience. It's not the most fun thing to talk about, but this morning, we just got some new information on inflation, and I just want to mention it to you because we can tie it to a few other stories. One of the readings that we received on inflation, and we get these readings periodically. We'll get them every couple of weeks. So if you're like, hey, we just had a data point on inflation, you're right, we did. We just had a data point on inflation. It showed that we were seeing the highest inflation that we've seen in 4 decades. Guess what? We got another data point that says the same thing. And so what this is doing is it's further confirming that inflation is not transitory, that it is here, and that it's very high. And why does that matter? It matters because the higher the inflation, the less your dollar buys you. And we want your dollar to get you exactly what you should get. And so what this reading is showing us is that while we're seeing other economic data be somewhat resilient, and I'm using that somewhat resilient carefully, to the effects of the pandemic and what we've all been confronting as far as challenges over the last year, inflation is here, and it's here at a high level. And now we've seen several months of it being at a very high level. And so the way that this can impact your life is not only with your purchasing power, but also in the future, if you're looking to buy a home, get a loan for a car, borrow money. What we're anticipating is, because inflation is higher, the Federal Reserve is going to raise interest rates to try to cool down the inflation. It can be complicated to talk about some of this stuff, but that's essentially what they're going to do. So there's all that talk about the Federal Reserve. When you hear about inflation, is about how expensive or how cheap it is to borrow money. That's one of the major ways that we're going to be talking about this. But the inflation in and of itself, and how it's impacting your life, or the price of food, for example, is a very real thing. So if you're thinking to yourself, wow, I just bought milk, suddenly our milk price is going up again. Yes, that's what the data is showing, that we're seeing prices continuing to go up. And so far, guess what? You've actually hung in there. The consumer, more or less, has hung in there. Like, we've continue to shop. And we haven't necessarily super hit the brakes, but that's the concern. America's the largest economy in the world. If you ever feel less important in your own life, just remember you're one of the most important consumers in the entire world because you're fueling the American economy. And so we don't want to see you slow down. We want you to live the life that you're meant to live. We want you to shop the way that you want to shop. That's actually best for the economy here and all over the world. So this is why we have to pay attention to inflation, even though that's not the most exciting topic. I much rather talk about things like, have you seen Kim Kardashian's new Vogue cover, by the way? I personally really like it. That's a side story. But inflation is a big issue. You're going to continue to hear about it. This is, again, it's just pressure building. And there's economic pressure and also political pressure. So just don't think you're crazy. If you're like, prices keep going higher, they're continuing to go higher. And where that intersection is between they get too high that you start slowing down is what we're really watching for. Now, there's a big story that many of you have asked about. Mary, Kelly, Emily, you guys are asking about the Canadian trucking convoy. Some call it the Freedom Convoy. I think that's the name that this group has chosen. And I say this group because based on my reading of it, let's just take a big step back on this and the why I'm even mentioning the trucking convoy and inflation. One of the reasons that inflation happens is not just that you have a lot of stimulus in the economy, a lot of dollars in the economy. If you have more dollars in the economy, you have anything that's a lot in the economy, you have more shoes in the economy, the value of that can go down, right? If you have a lot of something, it's hard to keep the price high. So if you have a lot of dollars in the economy, it's hard to keep the value at a stable level. So that's one of the reasons why we're seeing inflation. But the other reason we're seeing inflation is because of what we've seen through this pandemic, supply chain issues. And the supply chain issues are causing an issue with supply and demand. And if you have an issue with supply and demand, that affects purchasing. So the other day I went to the grocery store. I was looking for Cliff Bars for my kids. Don't at me. They love these things. I know they're full of sugar. I'm trying to do the best that I can. Cliff Bars haven't been in our local grocery store for like a week, 2 weeks. Like, where are they? What happened to them? Why are they not there? And if I see them next time, eventually down the road, our price is going to go up. Is it a delivery issue? Is there a supply chain issue? Maybe the company couldn't get the ingredient. Is it a trucking issue? You don't really know, but it's definitely affecting me as a consumer. I want to buy something. I can't buy it. That's affecting the company, and it could affect the company saying, hey, in order to get this to the store, in order to do this better, we actually have to raise prices. And so the way that this is tied to trucking, if I saw one statistic, and listen, there's statistics for everything, so you always have to be a little careful with them. But we know that for goods and services all over the country, it's really dependent on the trucking industry. You know, over 70% was one of the statistics I saw. So, I mean, everything, despite all the technology that we have, and you think, oh, things aren't plain. No, a lot is moving by rail and a lot is still moving by trucks. So truckers are really, really important to us. And that's one of the issues when we're looking at this trucking protest that's happened in Canada and how it could affect you in the United States, or perhaps you're in Canada as well. One of the ways we're looking at it is the supply chain issue because there's traffic jams. And those traffic jams are halting the flow of goods. So much so that is impacting major companies like Ford, for example. So let me back up. We talked about the trucking convoy a couple weeks ago when it first started. These truckers were headed to Ottawa. Part of the motivation for this was the vaccine mandates in Canada. Canada has really strict pandemic policies, and there were those that did not want vaccine mandates specifically for the trucking industry that was requiring it for re-entry into Canada. And because truckers go back and forth between the U.S. and Canada so much, this was an issue. Since that time, though, this story has evolved. Yes, there are some that were protesting the vaccine mandate, but in some ways, it's also included others that are protesting other powers of government. And again, I'm using broad strokes. I really wish I could be there and talk to the people that are continuing to protest in Ottawa. I actually read, it was a very interesting journalist perspective. His name is Matt Gurney from Canada. And he was there in the crowd, and I was reading his Substack. And I appreciated his perspective, so I wanted to share this with you because he was trying to answer the question, well, who are these people? Who is part of this protest? What do they actually want? That is fundamentally the question that a lot of you are asking as well. What do people want? What is this all about? So here's how he described it. He said, are there good, frustrated people just trying to be heard in the crowd? Yes. Are there bad people in the crowd, including some who've waved hate symbols and harassed or attacked others? Yes. Are there people taking careful care of the roads and sweeping up trash and shoveling ice and snow off the sidewalk? Yes. Are there hard men milling about, keeping a wary eye on anyone who seems out of place? Yes. Is it a place where some people are having good-natured fun? Yes. Is it a place some other people would rightly be afraid to go? Yes. And so on, he writes. So I think that's one of the important takeaways from this. If you're looking for just like, who are these people? Well, apparently there's a lot of different people that are a part of this group. One national security analyst in Canada said that this idea for a convoy, this idea for this sort of protest predates the vaccine issue. It's just become a channel for other frustration. There are those that are raising a question about, well, who's actually funding this? This is why I'm sure you've seen this question about the GoFundMe pages. There's been a question about, well, who's actually funding this protest from taking place? And are there other elements that are using those that are protesting against a vaccine mandate and trying to bring up other issues? Again, just being general, other issues. One of the perspectives that Matt Gurney shared is that on the ground there, he said that he stumbled on another zone of protest that looked a lot more fortified, a lot more organized than truckers that are blocking the street. And he had concerns about that. He also had concerns about law enforcement in the area saying that they needed help, wondering what does that mean? Who could come in and try to clear out this area? If it's a peaceful protest, does it warrant that? So I think you should know that there's a lot of somewhat confusion about exactly what's at the heart of this protest. And there are some that are saying, hey, that confusion is because that's politically motivated. The confusion is from people that don't want people protesting the vaccine mandate and don't want people speaking their mind. This is all politically motivated. And there are some that say, well, no, there is an element in this group that seems beyond the vaccine mandate. So there are conflicting streams of information. One of the real things that's happening, though, is a traffic jam on some of the major bridges in and out of Canada and the United States. This is really critical because we are huge trading partners. This affects a lot of different industries, not just the car industry, although I'm going to mention that because I think it's important that you know that a company like Ford, for example, had to issue a statement and had to adjust shifts because there's certain supply that's not getting to their plants where people are working. And so Ford said that the interruption of the Detroit-Windsor Bridge hurts customers, auto workers, suppliers, communities, and companies on both sides of the border that are already 2 years into parts shortages resulting from a global semiconductor issue, COVID and more. We've talked about that semiconductor issue. Let me show you something else, though. For those of you who are familiar with the area, I'm not as familiar with this part of the country. This is the Ambassador Bridge in Detroit. It is the busiest international crossing in North America. The busiest international crossing in North America. And you can see this is where you see the truckers lined up blocking this bridge. Now, this is quickly changing. This situation is quickly changing. So it seemed at the time, according to the reports that I was reading, that there were some ways to move around this particular conduit, but this is a major one, and it's slowing people down. It's slowing the flow of traffic down. But some of the truckers that were interviewed said, listen, this vaccine mandate is really important. It's not just about, this is about being told to do something that we don't want to do. And we're willing to take a stand about it. It's that big of an issue for us. And by the way, we've been through a lot over the last 2 years and no one's really listening to us. And we don't want this vaccine mandate to be a part of our business. By the way, we don't even want it to be a part of our lives. So it's a serious issue. And I think that there's multiple perspectives that you're going to hear just around this one issue. What I want you to understand, though, is regardless of anyone's opinion on it, the real effect of it is affecting supplies. It is affecting the movement of goods back and forth. And that can have a real wide sweeping impact for a while to come. And so the question just becomes, what's worth it? Right? What is the equation? What's the end result? What gets us out of this? Some have asked the question about, well, what's going to happen in the United States? There are some reports the Department of Homeland Security apparently issued something today with a concern that there could be trucking protests or traffic around the Super Bowl that could take place, and that would be the beginning of sort of a protest that would be headed to Washington, D.C. Again, these are just reports, but I think it's something to be aware of. Here's a broader question for you, and I'm curious what you think about this. Canada has a really, really high vaccination rate. Very, very high. 90% was one of the data points I read today. In the trucking association that represents a lot of truckers in Canada, they say it's more than 80%, 85% of their truckers are vaccinated. If you look at America, the majority of Americans are vaccinated. You can look at different statistics, 1 dose, 2 dose, anywhere between 60 to 70% of Americans that are eligible are vaccinated. If you look at a city like New York, I looked at it this morning, for adults that are eligible, you're talking about more than 90% are vaccinated. You know, New York has its requirements, though, to go into a restaurant or museum or really do anything inside. You have to show a vaccine card. So at one point, if this is an issue about vaccine mandates, at what point do we say to each other, and this is a political question, but it's also a social question. We're at a certain point in the pandemic. You have very high vaccination rates, a lot of places. Do you need the vaccine mandate? Do you still need the vaccine mandate? If there's a showdown on that, like, where is the point? For some people, it'll never be unless everyone's vaccinated, that they want vaccinated in their community. For others, they may say, 80% of us, 60% of us, 50% of us were vaccinated. The other percentage has some prior infection. We're good. I'm curious about that because the vaccine mandates have become such a politically charged topic, let alone a health policy, which is where it was supposed to be the conversation, right? It's really a politically charged topic. So at what point? At what point is it not? At what point does the mandate not exist? At what point, rationally, does it make sense? I don't know the answer to that, but I'm curious what you think about that. Because that was the goal, right? The goal was to get people vaccinated and to get us past the period in the pandemic. I know there's a lot of debates about the efficacy of the vaccine, how long it's going to last, all those things. But I'm just curious, is there a point? Is there a point where the vaccine mandates don't make sense? One trucker that was interviewed at a truck stop I was watching this morning on social media, and he said that he had to make a 5-hour trip out of his way to get to where he needed to be between Canada and the United States. And he happened to be vaccinated. And he was like, I just don't understand this traffic. Like, it's really hurting a lot of people. But he took another stance on it that he was obviously frustrated, but then he went bigger. Like, it was such a bigger topic. He said, I know we're all really frustrated. We've been really frustrated for 2 years. He says, I've worked for 2 years without a vacation. I'm super frustrated. Everyone is so frustrated. He's like, there has to be a way out of this. And I was like, you're hitting it. You're hitting it on the head. It is about frustration, isn't it? And different ways of expressing it. And the stakes are high. The stakes of expressing frustration are high because it's high for you and your body and what decisions you want to make for yourself and for your family. That's like the most fundamental question that's out there, right? It's also high when you look at the economy, people's livelihoods. So there's a lot at stake with this, and I'll be curious how this story evolves. There's a lot of stories too that begin with great intentions, and then people come in and hijack them, either politically, outside forces. So I just want you to know that it's a nuanced conversation. I liked Matt Gurney's description of it, of saying, hey, there's some really good people here that really are protesting something that they're very passionate about. There's also some people here that I'm not quite sure about, and they're both present. So to me, I'm like, well, what's the bigger conversation? Why does this matter? The immediate effect is the supply issue. Really, the longer this goes on, it becomes even more of an issue for all of us. And then there's the broader question about the vaccine mandates. If that really was the catalyst, and we're starting to see mass mandates pull back, do you think that is just the precursor to vaccine mandates eventually being pulled back? What do you think? Let's talk about those mass mandates real quick here, because we've seen a couple states come out and say that they're no longer doing mask mandates, or that they're giving a timeline. And we really got to pay attention to this though, because governors are saying there's no statewide mask mandate, but it's up to a school district or a county. So that doesn't necessarily mean that you'll never see a mask again. It just means that they're deferring that to the locale, right? And we've seen that in some cases already in places like Texas, for example. If a business wanted to require a mask at a certain point in this pandemic, they could do it even if the county wasn't requiring it. And for the most part, private businesses can make a lot of their own calls. We just don't really realize that because we're not being asked to do anything usually when we're walking in and trying to shop. One of the interesting parts, I was just like, oh, I want to take a closer look at Connecticut, because and the governor there said that the superintendents, schools, and mayors can make that election for themselves. Make that election, they can elect the mask mandates. I thought that was a really interesting word, election. And I was like, I wonder when Governor Lamont is up for re-election. Oh, it's later this year. You know what? Mask mandates in general, even if you're like, okay, I'm totally on board, it's still a relationship with the government that looks different than it did a couple years ago. And one of the things that we've seen is that there has been pushback against mandates or those that are supporting mandates. We saw that in Virginia's governor race, where you have this new up and coming Republican defeat a well-known Democrat, in part because he was really about getting the kids back to school. So you have to ask the question, is this really about the pandemic and where we're at right now? We are seeing dropping cases. That's a good thing. We want to see lower cases. Or is there also political motivation in saying, oh, it's cool. Like, you guys, if you want to do masks, you do masks, but I'm not going to. You got it. What is the politics of that? We have to remember there is an election in November. I know. Midterm elections. And your governor may or may not, just depends. All right, final thing real quick, and then I'm going to go back to your questions for those that are joining us live. But a lot of questions. Stephanie, you were asking as well about what's going on with the Republican Party and what we're seeing headlines-wise about January 6th. So let me start back at last weekend. The Republican National Committee has decided to censure Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, two lawmakers. And these lawmakers are sitting on the January 6th committee that is investigating the events of that day. Now, censure is important. In Congress, if you censure somebody, it is a public, I can't say that word. I'm going to mispronounce it. You're basically just publicly saying that you disagree with, you're publicly punishing someone. You're embarrassing them. I mean, for more or less, you're saying we're going to censure you. We're not punishing you in a real way, but publicly we're going to come out and be on the record that we're against you. And it is embarrassing. It's not really consequential, but it's embarrassing. And it certainly gets a lot of attention. So you can do that in the Senate. You can do that in the House of Representatives. You can also, I could censure my kids. They deserve it. Sometimes they're really sweet. Okay. But what the Republican Party did here is they censured Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger. And so this is the resolution to formally do so. There was a lot of talk in the party about doing this. And there's been talk about whether or not these two lawmakers can stay in the party. And so why? Why are they saying this? Well, some Republican lawmakers don't think that the January 6th event should be investigated in the way that Congress is doing so. Senator Rubio had some good statements this weekend, which kind of really expressed where the conflict is. He's called the January 6th investigative committee that Congress is in the House a scam. He's like, this is politically motivated. This is there just to continue to bring this issue up. It's actually not helping investigate whether or not the people that are held in prison should be tried in a court of law. His point was, if you did something wrong, you broke the law, you have to handle that through the legal system, and that's not Congress's job. The other argument to that, though, the counter argument is, yeah, it is Congress's job, because Congress's job is oversight, and oversight of all sorts of things, including what happens at the Capitol. And so, but what are the politics involved? Are Democrats really doing that in earnest because they want to really find out what happened? Or are they doing it because they want to keep this in the bloodstream because it was such a controversial, awful event and they want to hurt Republicans? So that's kind of where the rub is. Congresswoman Cheney has said that she wants to find out exactly what the role is of the White House. And she's come out very aggressively against President Trump and against that day specifically. And she's paid a political price for that amongst her peers. And so they're seeing this. But she remains very outspoken and very much committed to continuing the investigation. So what they said here, the Republican National Committee, they say a series of things. I'll put this up under the video so that you can see it, because it's all, it's about the stance of the Republican Party at this point in time on a myriad of different issues, including Representatives Cheney and Kinzinger. The part where it got a lot of attention is that the party said that Representatives Cheney and Kinzinger are participating in a Democrat-led persecution of ordinary citizens engaged in legitimate political discourse. The legitimate political discourse is what people had issues with, saying, hey, is legitimate political issues discourse what happened at the Capitol? And you have senators coming out, Republican senators saying, no, it's not, because if you're smashing windows, that's not political discourse, even if it was quote unquote peaceful. So that's what happened from that point on, from the censure from this weekend, then has kind of come to a confrontation on Capitol Hill, because you have Republicans in the Senate have been the most outspoken this week, saying the Republican National Committee should not have done this. Actually, there was a great quote. Let me see if I have it here. I think from Senator Capito. Yeah, she said, we've got a lot of issues. She's a Republican from West Virginia. We've got a lot of issues that we should be focusing on besides censuring two members of Congress because they have a different opinion. She went on to say, I thought free speech for everybody. And so what the senators are saying is, why is the Republican National Committee making this a big issue again? Why are they bringing attention to it again? Why are they not allowing this debate to take place in the party? And so you're seeing a focus. You're seeing different lawmakers try to focus on what's going to happen later this year, which is the election. And if Republicans, this is the thinking, this is the sort of the messaging from some Republicans, because some believe in this, some believe in this completely. Obviously, there were Republicans that censured these representatives. But you have another element of the party that disagrees with that element. So you have two sides of the party that are confronting each other. And ultimately, a lot of elections are about identity. What does the party stand for? What is the party advocating for? Where does January 6th fit into that for the Republican Party? The Republican Party is trying to navigate that. And then you have the Democrat Party with their own strategy about how to engage with January 6th too. And the question that ultimately comes down to is, for the American public, how much of an issue is that going to be in November when people head to the polls and are then choosing who's going to be my representative? And what do both parties use to actually identify themselves, distinguish themselves? How do they describe themselves? This is the fundamental battle for identity that's happening in a lot of political parties. But we saw it this week very much in Technicolor, because you had these very powerful Republicans in the Senate, like Senator McConnell, saying like, why are you censuring these people? Why are you wasting time in that? Like, we got to be united. Let's move on. And that's sort of the takeaway. So if you have any questions on that, let me know. But I hope that that sort of explains what you're seeing. And because you can see someone being censured, not censored, censured, I want you to know that it's significant, but it's not necessarily consequential. There's other things that can be consequential. Okay, quick final thing, real quick, and then we'll get to any of your questions today. I wanted to show you what's going on with Russia. Had a couple really interesting conversations over the last few days about what we're seeing there. And I just want to show you this map because it's really helpful just to see the geography again. Russia is holding some military drills in Belarus. Belarus is a strong ally of Russia. But you see the Black Sea that is, Crimea is a peninsula that now Russia has taken over the last several years. That's when Russia invaded last time. They took over Crimea. And Russia, the Black Sea is very important to Russia for a couple reasons, but let me show you what one very key one. And I'm going to kind of zoom out. So there's just a very simple Google map of the Black Sea. So you see the Black Sea is, really, it's large, but it's surrounded by a lot of countries. But there is a part of the Black Sea that is a strait that allows you to get from the Black Sea out into the broader oceans. And you need Turkey to do this. This is a strait that runs right through Turkey. And that enables ships that are in the Black Sea to get out. Otherwise, Russia would have to use, St. Petersburg up north. Much more difficult. So the Black Sea is important for that. So one of the questions that's been asked over the last several weeks is what is Russia's true intention with Ukraine? Will they invade Ukraine and take a small portion of it? I hate to say small portion, but you see Crimea on the map again. It's a very, relative to the rest of the country, small. But because the Pentagon has been so clear that they're worried about other concerns, I'm not trying to fear monger. I want to be very careful of this, but because we've reported so much on cyber attacks over the last, 2 years, and that have been believed to be Russian related, there's so much focus on what's happening here on the border of Ukraine and Belarus. But someone I just spoke with, again, on background was saying, one of the key elements to war is the element of surprise. Russia doesn't have that right now. We have all the pictures of the tanks at the border. They're being very clear. Look at all of our stuff just right there. Maybe they're doing it because they truly do want to show united force on the border. Maybe it really is because there's a concern about how much NATO is encroaching on what they believe is territory that's too close to them. Maybe it's all to do with that. But I just don't want to so focus on it that we don't think about, well, what are the other things that Russia could be doing while everyone's focused here that could really cause a lot of pain. It's just that continuous focus where we're talking about exactly where everything that Russia has is. It's all right there. So is that what they want us to do? I'm curious. I'm just curious about that. It's really key to remember that so much of the military is not about the forward forces, right? It's not about the tanks that are coming in. It's also about the support team, the food, the fuel, the medical. We talked a little bit about this already this week, but I think it's a really key point. The reason why there's so much focus about what Russia could do over the next, 2-3 weeks is because the ground is supposed to be the most frozen in the area, easiest for crossing. If it's not frozen, if it starts to thaw, you're in areas that could be rivers or streams or marshes or swamps, and that becomes much more difficult, not necessarily for the tanks, but let's say the guys that are hauling the fuel for the tanks. And it becomes a more complicated endeavor. And that's why there's so much focus about what's happening right now, what's happening in this exact moment. I did ask, I was curious, can tanks just fill up on the side? You don't think about refueling tanks, do you? I never have, because we really haven't looked at that much traditional warfare like we saw in World War II, quote unquote, traditional. But all of that, you have to have a plan. You can't just drive tanks into a country and be like, where's the fuel? You're going to need to figure out how you're going to fuel up, where you're going to do it, how to protect yourself. So there's a lot going into a quote unquote invasion. And that's why there's been questions about, well, how far does Vladimir Putin want to go if he actually is going in there? So we'll see. The other really important thing, and I don't want to forget this, you'll hear me talk about it next week, but we're coming up on the anniversary of that invasion of Crimea. Remember the invasion of Crimea and what happened between Ukraine and Russia in 2014. There was a different precursor to it, prologue, if you will. There was protests in the streets against the very corrupt Ukrainian government. Corruption continues to be a huge issue in Ukraine, which is part of the reason why it's not part of NATO and why the U.S. and others just kind of keeps them at arm's length, but also wants to be friends because of the position to Russia. Corruption's a big deal. So the people were protesting. That led to the ousting of the president that was a quote unquote pro-Russian president. And then you had Russia do this invasion. Again, very elementary, just follow the bouncing ball, but that's sort of what happened. We don't have that sort of protest that's happening in the streets right now, but we're coming up on the anniversary of Russia coming into Ukraine. So is Putin as poetic as wanting to invade at the exact same day, exact same time? I don't know. But I think it's the irony of that, the last invasion happened during an Olympics, a Winter Olympics, and happened at the same time of year. We can't ignore it. So this is why there's a lot of intensity over the next 2 weeks. And you're seeing all these people, the French president, you're seeing representatives from the UK travel to Russia, meet. Everyone's trying different parts of diplomacy, but at the end of the day, we don't really know what Putin's actual goal is here. And that's why I want us just to keep an open mind about what's happening. All right, guys, can I answer any questions for you as to some of the big news items that we covered or that we did not? I'd love to hear from you as we kind of move through this is a lot of big stories. And I, like that trucker said, I'm sure that a lot of us are frustrated on a lot of different levels, right? About any number of stories that are happening. So let's see. Interesting. So there's a question about the National Archives retrieval of government documents from President Trump and a potential violation of the Federal Records Act. Let me talk about that for a second. It's super interesting. So the National Archives are responsible for just keeping a record of everything that happens in government. If I was sitting in the press office at the White House my emails aren't really my emails. They belong to the American people. And so there's a huge collection of what happens in an administration. It would be a great interview to find out exactly where the line is drawn, because nobody wants, my emails on any number of issues, but especially when it's the president, correspondence with the president, that really matters. I'm not as familiar with this story. This is something I caught out of the corner of my eye, but it's been a question. President Trump hasn't wanted to give over certain records that he says that were executive privilege, because any White House is somewhat protected with executive privilege, which means I don't have to share certain things, because if I did, then I couldn't have, let's say we're all having a conversation about what hypothetically could happen with Russia in the Oval Office. Some of that I want my advisors to share freely. And if they know that they're going to be recorded and it's going to be locked into history forever in America, then they may not speak as freely. And we need to have free conversation in the Oval Office. We can't have people worried, censoring themselves. But a court ruled just recently that President Trump's assertion of executive privilege could not stand for this particular group of documents related to January 6th, and that Congress would be able to get a hold of that. Now, this continuation of the story about where those documents were and what happened from this point on, I'm not as well read into it, but I think it's a very interesting thing to know how much is held by the National Archives, and a lot of it is not just held at the National Archives, but at presidential libraries. So if you go to, let's say President Obama's presidential library, some of the archives that you're seeing, they're part of the National Archives, but they're stored there. I don't think we know President Trump's, where his library will be and what that will look like. But it's something that will continue to follow. I love the National Archives because if you just want to mess around, just because you're bored one day, you could find all sorts of really interesting things, So, and they're available for me to share. So for someone like me who's a journalist that doesn't have access to, let's say, Getty Images, which is a huge expense, sometimes I can't share a certain story. I don't have any images to go with them, but the National Archives would have something that's part of the public domain. So that's part of why it's important. It's a matter of public record. So let's see. A lot of you are having questions about representatives and the issues of representatives and term limits and what's going on with the midterm elections. And it's really a great question about term limits, and one that maybe we need to explore a little bit more. Washington, D.C., if you ever go and you're able to see what Washington, D.C. looked like at the beginning, no one wanted to live there. No one wanted to live there. It was hot. It was a swamp. It wasn't really well developed. I mean, it was beautiful. And it was an area that at the time was providing a bridge of some sort between the North and the South. And so that's why the nation's capital moved to Washington, D.C., closer to Virginia, where you had the stronghold of the southern states at the time. And you still had access from the northern states, right? But no one wanted to live there. People wanted to go home. They wanted to go home. Now you have politicians that are spending a lot of their time in Washington, D.C., and so that keeps them from being able to connect with their constituents. Although I wonder if some of you would feel differently that during the pandemic, when people are doing everything virtually, So, okay, those are some of what's going on right now. I hope that's helpful to you guys. Does every president have a library? You know what? I want to know when that started. I'm going to write that down. We're going to find out. When did that start? When did that tradition start? Because sometimes, presidents' own personal libraries became part of our libraries. Like Thomas Jefferson, he had a massive book collection, right? It became what started the Library of Congress. So sometimes there's been a merging of quote unquote libraries, and then you have this tradition of the presidential library. If any of you know that, let me know. And I would love to share that. But I think it would be really, really interesting to talk more about that. Have you been to any presidential libraries that you love? I don't know if I have been to any presidential libraries. But I would like to be. I mean, I think any of that history, I think, is so interesting to know behind the scenes, what was taking place, what sort of letters were being exchanged. That's one of the reasons we shared Walt Whitman. Do you see Walt Whitman? He wrote, obviously, some very famous American poems, and he wrote one, Captain, My Captain, Captain, Oh Captain, am I saying that wrong? to after Abraham Lincoln's assassination. That's something we're going to be marking, by the way, President Lincoln's birthday. We're going to be marking that in a couple days. February 12th, I believe, is his birthday. But we have a record of Walt Whitman correcting his own poem that the publishers apparently published mistakes. And we have that in the Library of Congress, and I love it. Oh, Reagan's library is, a lot of people love Reagan's library. And Jessica, you're saying Jimmy Carter's library was really interesting. I don't think there's a way. I know it's very easy, but the Bush Library at A&M, Reagan, a lot of you liked Reagan's library. I've heard amazing things about Reagan's library from all sides, Republican, Democrat. I was thinking about Reagan today, actually, because of how much inflation. When we talk about inflation, let's just go full circle. We're talking about seeing the highest levels since like 1982, since the early 1980s. And that's something that President Reagan really had to confront. So I thought it would be really good to go back and kind of figure out, what did they do then? It's different than now, but what did they do? What does that look like? So it's great. I mean, let me just end with this sort of peaceful, nice thought. Even though it's very easy to get very frustrated at people in elected office and those making, a lot of decisions, and sometimes very easy to feel that you're not represented. One thing that I've always felt talking to lawmakers is that they're always really interesting people. They're always sort of remarkable, and maybe you don't believe with their political perspective, but at the core of who they are usually some amazing stories. And when you have an appreciation for that, maybe you don't appreciate the end result of what some of the decisions that they're making. But it's a reminder that we are surrounded by some pretty amazing people, even if we don't always agree with them. So thank you again for all your support of SmartHER News. If you've been joining us live, one of the things we've been trying out are these badges. I forget to mention them, but on Instagram, if you watch us live, one of the benefits is that you could send a tip to us through badges. And these are ways that you're able at the very bottom of your screen to say, I want to buy a badge, and you're able to support SmartHER News through a click. Usually it's one click. If it's more complicated than that, it's probably not working appropriately, so I apologize. We are relaunching our retail store shortly, and we're working on a couple designs for you. So we're really excited about that. We were supposed to have it up and ready at the beginning of the year. And as you guys know, my whole family got hit. We were all super, super, super sick. So not just from COVID, but from all sorts of weird things that happened to us. So I'm hopeful that we're out of that. But after this week, I'm not quite sure. So some of you are asking about Joe Rogan. The Joe Rogan article is still on our website. If you'd like to read that commentary about Joe Rogan, you could do so through just going to our website. It should be in the featured box. If you're able to swipe through the featured box, it should be there. Or you can just search for it and it should come right up for you. Speaking of Joe Rogan, I didn't mention that. I know there's some updates to that story. Spotify has stood by Joe Rogan. He's continuing to do his podcast. He's also come out and said that there's so many updates since we last talked about it. I mean, there's been a flurry of activity criticizing him in all sorts of ways, beyond just sharing different perspectives on the pandemic. And one of the things he just recently said at a comedy show, I guess he just did in Austin, was that he said that no one should be listening to him for medical advice. We'll take that for what it's worth. But right now he's still broadcasting. He hasn't been, quote unquote, taken off the air by Spotify. Spotify has stood by him. And we'll see. Often with these stories, and that's why I really wanted to write about journalism at the beginning of this, is that you get a sense when these stories are going to take on a life of their own. They become more personal attacks. And that's what's happened. I'm not talking about the validity of the attacks or not. I'm just saying that the story has changed since really I wrote that column. But I really think it's important that we don't miss the point that Joe Rogan was in inviting a lot of different perspectives when it comes to the pandemic, was filling a need for people. People wanted more information, not less, more science, not less. And I know one nurse just wrote me and said, her issue with Joe Rogan is that she had people that came into her hospital that were mad that the hospital wasn't giving treatment that a person on Joe Rogan's show suggested. And she said, when you're in that situation, you're trying to help people and you get that sort of pushback. I can't imagine how difficult that is. So there are real life consequences to what people are hearing. And that could happen today based on what you're hearing from me. But I always believe that more conversation, more freedom, more diversity of opinion is always better. And fundamentally, I do trust the audience. I do trust you to make the best decision for you and your family. and that is your liberty to do so, which is why freedom of the press is really important. So anyhow, that's all that we have for today. Really grateful for your time. Thank you so much for participating. Thank you for all your great questions. And let me know what you think about this debrief. If you like it once a week, how you feel about it. If you like the shorter segments that we usually do Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. I'm trying to do those short 1-minute segments to really get you guys going, because I think that, if you just have a minute, we just want to make sure you have a place to go for quick, concise, nonpartisan information. All right. So you guys have a great day, and keep your questions and comments coming. I love hearing from you, and more on all of this on smarternews.com. I'll talk to you soon.